Hello everyone and welcome to chapter 40 of this Flutter course. In previous chapters, we've been talking about our auth process and also storing users' notes into a Firestore database. And in the previous chapter, we also talked about block. So I'm very aware that block could be an intimidating topic for some developers, and that getting started with block could just be conceived as like an extra step that you think you don't need. However, I can assure you, when you get more into professional software development, which may not be your goal, I completely am aware of that. But when you get more and more to professional software development, you'll understand that you need to separate various layers of your product, in that the presentation layer, where you're taking care of, for instance, displaying stuff on the screen to the user, shouldn't really have to talk with your authentication directly, or for instance, your authentication layer doesn't necessarily have to depend at all on other parts of the application. So block is going to allow you to, in a very clean and concise way, to separate the various layers of your application into their own concern layers. So, and the services are going to be only concerned with services, and then your UI is going to be only concerned with UI, and so on and so forth. So it could be beneficial if you could actually, before starting with this chapter, to go to the previous chapter and maybe watch it again, or maybe even practice yourself with block. I understand. I know for sure that the block libraries website, as we looked at in the previous chapter, they have quite a lot of examples, and I highly suggest that you go through some of those examples at least, and develop and implement those examples also yourself, to get a better hang of what block actually means and how you're supposed to use it. So if you've taken care of that and you understand like the basics of block, then we should be good to go for this chapter. So let me bring up the caption for what we're actually going to do in this chapter. You see, the way we have our application at the moment is that we have our authentication service, and our authentication service, let me just bring that to the screen here, and let's have a quick look at it. So if I go to our auth service, you'll see that we have quite a few functions in here. We have create user, and we are exposing the current user. We have login, logout, send email verification, and initialize. Now, this is all good. However, it's very raw the way it is, in that the UI is literally making calls to our auth service, which in turn is making calls to a provider, which is our, for instance, Firebase provider, auth provider. So if you go in here, you'll see Firebase auth provider, and that is talking directly with Firebase. So in a way, you could say that the UI is talking pretty much directly with Firebase. It's just going through some functions to get to Firebase, but that's what pretty much it's doing. So what we want to do in this chapter is to try to make sure that our authentication is behind a layer of block, meaning that all the logic that has anything to do with authentication is hidden behind a layer, which we're going to call Auth Bloc. So that's going to be our Auth Bloc. So it's like and as you remember from the previous chapter, every block has two parameters. One is what comes inside the block, so what's entered, and what is the output. The input to your block are your events. So you pass, for instance, your UI upon pressing a button, then you pass an event, a packaged event that we call our auth event. You're going to package that up with any parameters that particular event is required from you. You take that event and you give it to your auth block. Then your auth block is then going to have some time to process. You remember we had these on functions on your on your blocks when we talked about the counter block. We had on increment event, on decrement event, etc. So these are the events that come in. So we're going to package those events up from our UI and pass them to our auth block. Then our auth block is going to have some time for itself to process those events, and based on those events that it has received, and based on its current state, is going to either output the same state or it's going to output a new state. So events come in and states go out, and the auth block sits in the middle. So event, auth block, and state. And these are the three components that we're going to develop in this chapter. So let's go ahead and take care of our state. And remember, again, state, as its name indicates, is the state of authentication. Either you're logged in or you're logged out. Okay. And you could also be logged out with an error. Remember, so you're either logged in or logged out with an error. So we're going to start looking at these auth states. So what we need to first do is to create a file, as the caption indicates, under lib services auth block auth state. So let me do some reshuffling on the screen here. Maybe decrease the font size a little bit because it's just ginormous the way it is right now. So maybe this font is a little bit better. I'm going to put Visual Studio Code in there to the left, and then I'm going to bring strcpy to the right. Okay, so I'm going to close all these tabs that I have right here, how we left the application in the previous chapter. And let's go ahead inside lib. Let's see actually what we have in here. We have lib and we have services. And under services, we already have auth, but we don't have a folder called block. At the moment, we have auth provider, etc., etc. So let's go in auth and just create a new file in here and say block / auth state like this, .dart. Okay, so that's our auth state. Now, if you remember from the previous chapter when we talked about the counter block, usually states are immutable in that they're like at the generic state that every other state in your block inherits from is usually an abstract immutable class, meaning that it is a class pretty much almost with no logic at all. It may have a constant constructor, but in and on itself, it does nothing. So it just is dictating that, hey, every state that comes out of this auth block is of this type. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our auth state. So maybe I should actually increase the size of the font. So we're going to start by writing our states, as you can see. So we're going to code that in auth state.dart file. So I'm going to go ahead and just say abstract class auth state. Okay. And let's just create a constant constructor for it as well, in case one of our states needs to also have a constant constructor. So this is a pattern that you may have already been used to by creating abstract classes. And if you have like subclasses that conform to your abstract classes, and those subclasses actually want to have constant constructors, then you need to have a constant constructor in your abstract class as well, so that those subclasses can actually call that const constructor in the abstract class. Otherwise, you won't be able to have constant constructors for your subclasses. So for instance, if I say abstract class blah extends auth state, and if I say const blah like this, you can see it says a constant constructor can't call a non-constant superconstructor. And that is the reason that I usually create a const constructor for my abstract classes for states and for the events. Okay. Okay, now we have our abstract class auth state. Now let's go and make it immutable. And for that, we need to import material. Or actually, it is foundation. Let's import from foundation in that case. And we could just say show immutable. Can we do it like that? Yeah, that works as well. Okay. So that's that. We have a generic auth state. So actually, I don't mean generic in the terms of like a Dart generics, which I just mean an abstract class that every other auth state can conform to. Okay, so we have basically we have quite a few states. So I'm just going to start doing and creating those auth states one at a time. So while you're authenticating, for instance, let's say that you are you've just opened the application, and then we need to basically tell our authentication provider, which is Firebase, to initialize itself. While it's doing that, then our auth state is in the state of loading or initializing, whatever you want to call it. But we kind of need to have a state that indicates to the application that, hey, something is happening with the auth process, and it is in the process of loading. So let's go ahead and define that. So let's just say auth state loading extends auth state, just like that. Okay. And this could also have a const constructor. So let's just say it like that. Okay, so that's the state of loading. And we can actually use the state of loading. And I believe we're actually going to use it while the user, for instance, is has just opened the application and the application is initializing. And we can also use it, for instance, when you tap the login button in order to log into the application and we're communicating with Firebase. And that is also a state of loading. Okay. So you will see soon now these states are very important in how the UI then reacts to various events that are, or various states that are happening in our auth block. So let's say then we have the loading state. Let's just define a logged in state. So when the user has already logged into our application, then that is its own separate state. So let's go ahead and say auth state logged in, and it extends the auth state. And now this is important to see, okay, when you're logged into the application, what does the application actually need from us? Well, the only thing the application needs from us when you have logged in with a user is the current user. At the moment, we are going to our auth provider or our auth service and grabbing the current user. But if we're going to move over to block and like blockifying our entire auth process, then it makes more sense for us to grab the current user that has logged into the application from the current state of our auth block. I mean, to me, it's really beautiful because it makes sure that we can separate the auth service and the auth provider from the UI by putting a block in the middle. So, I mean, the name kind of it may sound like you're blocking the UI, but that's not how block is written as BLOC. It's not BLOCK. So but that's what we need to do. So let's just say we have a final auth user and it's going to auto import it for me. If you're using Vim, if you're on Linux, or if you're using Sublime that is not able to auto import things, then you'll need to you need to import auth user yourself. Okay. So let's say that a state of logged in always carries with itself the currently logged in user. Okay. So we're just going to say user, and I'm going to create a constant constructor then for this class as well, which in turn is going to call soup automatically for us on auth state. Okay, so that's our state of logged in. Now let's say that we're going to define also a logged out state, but also we want to we actually before we go to logged out, maybe we have to talk about login. When you're trying to log in a user in our application today, if we go to our login view, you'll see that upon pressing the button to log in, then we're doing a try await of auth service Firebase login. So we're literally going towards Firebase directly. And then if anything goes wrong, then we're doing like is user not found auth exception, wrong password auth exception. So we're handling our exceptions in this way. And the way that we need to do this now with with block is that we need to produce a state. You see, the UI needs to only talk with that block. So it says, hey, block, here's an event, go log in. And then it says, and then the block is going to do some processing. And then maybe it says, oh, incorrect email, or password is wrong, or whatever. So that needs to be its own state. So at the point where an exception has occurred during login, that is a state, login failure. We're going to call it login failure. So the UI is then going to react to that particular state in order to display, for instance, an error message to the user, like we are doing today. So let's go ahead and say class auth state login failure. And we're going to extend our auth state in here. And what we're going to do is that upon a login failure, we need to carry with that state the actual exception that caused the failure. So let's just in here say exception, just like we're carrying the user with us. When you logged in, we carry the exception with us as well if you couldn't log in. Okay, so that's how you should think as well. So your state should carry with them all the information the UI or the consumer of that block requires in order to be able to fulfill its requirements. So in this case, upon not being able to log in, the UI is going to require the actual exception that occurred so that it can switch on it or do some if statements and see what kind of exception it was and display the correct message to the user. So let's go ahead and then define that. And since we've expected an exception in here, I'm going to create a constant constructor here as well, like that. Well, actually, we got a warning here that says prefer declaring const constructors on immutable classes. That's actually beautiful. Sorry, const, fantastic. Okay, so that's our login failure. Then what we need is, you remember also, at the moment, since we have our counter block in here and the counter application that we did in the previous chapter, I can't show you the UI of the application, but if you can recall, what we also had is if you try to log in with a user and that user's email is not verified, then we're actually gonna what we were doing is that we were sending the user to the needs verification view or something that we call it. Let's see, verify email view, right? So we sent the user to this view, and we need to also produce that state. So upon user pressing the login button, and if our auth block realizes that, hey, this user does exist, but he or she hasn't verified their email address, then we're going to produce a state telling the UI that, hey, this user needs to verify their information. So let's go ahead and implement that. So we're going to say class auth state needs verification extends auth state. Okay. And in here, we're just going to grab this as a const constructor like this. All right. So that's that. And also after doing that, so now we have login and login failure, we have needs verification, and we have the loading state if we're in the middle of, for instance, making an API call that could take some time. The other state that we need is also logged out. If you're in the logout state, then we need to produce that. So let's just say class auth state. Why is everything yellow? Class auth state logged out. Okay. And this is going to extend auth state as well. Let's then make a constant constructor for this like this. Great. All right. So logged out. When you're logged out, you're logged out. There's nothing that the logged out state actually has to carry with itself. It doesn't have to carry the currently logged in user or anything, or even the current user in Firebase, even if we have anonymous users. The logged out state for our application doesn't have to carry with itself anything. Okay. And last but not least, we also have to define our logout errors. So upon logging out, you could also encounter some errors, like if Firebase for some reason is trying to make an API call and that API call doesn't succeed, then it is going to give us an error. So let's just define that as well. Let's just say class. You see, we have that already for login failure. Let's go and actually copy that and paste it right here. And in here, instead of login, I'm just going to say logout failure and copy that name and put it in the constant constructor as well. Great. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 auth states. So that looks actually really good. So our auth states are now defined. Okay. And please save this file as well. Now we need to define the inputs. You see, the states have been the output of our auth block, which we're going to write soon. The auth block, we haven't written it yet, but these have been the outputs. Now, what are the inputs? Imagine in our auth inputs, we have to think about what the UI is actually going to call. So the UI is going to send packages of data to this auth block, and these packages of data are the events. So we need to make sure that the events can contain with them the data that the UI can package and send to our auth block. For instance, during logging in, what event is it? Okay, let's just say auth event login. What should it contain? Well, it should be the email and password, something like that. Okay, upon log out, okay, that's a logout event. What should it contain? No, it's nothing. It's just a logout event. It shouldn't even provide the email and password. It should log out the currently logged in user from the application. So we need to think about events and their consumers, and also the states and their consumers. So you have to pack enough information both into your states and into your events so that the consumer of your block can actually both receive enough information and be able to pack enough information to send to your auth, to your block. Okay, now what we need to do is just to go and define our auth event. Right here in lib services auth block auth state, we have written our auth state. So I'm just going to close that file and let's go in the same folder called block in here. You see lib services auth block. We're going to create a new file called auth event. So right click, new file, auth event. And all right, now we have our auth event, and we need to do something very similar to what we did with auth state, in that we need to define a superclass, an abstract class that basically engulfs all other auth events. So every auth event in our application is going to be of this type. So let's say immutable, and we don't have access to it yet. So let's just let me just write it for now. Let's just abstract class auth event and a constant constructor, which you now know why we're creating. And immutable comes from foundation. We've already done this, so import immutable. Okay. Expected string. Use show. Sorry, I program in quite a lot of languages, Python and Rust and Swift and you name it, JavaScript. So it's sometimes a little bit messy in my head about imports. So there are quite a lot of different ways of importing things in different languages. So I sometimes mix them up. So now we have our auth event, which is an immutable abstract class. So now what we need from the UI is, upon it wanting to initialize our auth, you see at the moment, let's see actually what we have in our main Dart file. This is just us having a look. You can see here, that's the counter block, but how we had it before is, if you remember in our homepage, we had, upon the entire homepage being loaded, we were saying auth service firebase initialize. So this is a signal from the UI that needs to now go to our auth block and say, hey, initialize yourself. So let's define that signal or event. Let's say auth event initialize extends auth event. And this event has no parameters. It's, as you saw in main Dart, it's literally just a function being called. So we're going to represent it with an event that has no parameters, but has a constant constructor. Okay, that's that. Okay, we have now our auth event initialize. What we also need is an auth event for logging in. And as I mentioned, it's very simple. It's just with an email and password. So let's just go ahead and say auth event login, something like this, or login with a capital I, extends auth event. And what do we need? We need two parameters to be passed in here. Let's just say final string email, and we also need a password. So let's just type that here, password. And now we have the email and password. We're just going to create a constructor here and make it constant, just like that. Okay. So now we have our login event. And so login event should carry with itself every piece of information that the auth block will need in the future in order to log in that user into our provider, which in this case is Firebase. Okay. So after defining login, we also need to define logout. Now, if you have a look at our there are so many files in here. So views, and we have notes, and then we have, excuse me, we have notes view. If you have a look at notes view, if you have a look at this logout, what it's doing, as you can see, is a await auth service Firebase logout. So, so this is a clear event with no parameters. It's just telling the auth block then, or in this case, the auth service, that, hey, you need to log out. No parameters, log out the current user. Okay, so let's go and define that as well in here. So let's just say class auth event log out extends auth event, and it has no parameters, as I mentioned. So let's create a constant constructor for it, which in turn is going to call the constant constructor of the abstract class called auth event. All right, fantastic. Those were the only events that we had to define: initialize, login, and logout. So these are the inputs to the block, and then we had our auth states, which are the outputs of our auth block, which we're gonna write right now, actually. So we have the events and the states. The only thing that's missing is the auth block itself. So let's go ahead inside this block folder, create an auth block file. So auth block block dart. So now we need to actually write our auth block, and this is, for me at least, this is like the most fun. Um, so because we're going to put together two pieces of information: the states and the events, and now we're creating the actual logic of our authentication block. So this is very exciting. So let's say class auth block, like this, extends block. Now it's going to complain saying that, well, it doesn't exist yet. So let's go ahead and import that, as you can see here. Now remember, block, if you go into source code, it has two parameters, it has two generic data types in here: event and state. Our events are called auth event, and it's going to auto import that. And then we have to say auth state, like this, which also is going to be auto imported. So just like our auth service, if we go back to our auth service in here, you'll see that our auth service at the moment is taking in as a parameter a provider. So we're going to do the exact same thing in our auth block. It's going to say, give us a provider to work with. Is it a Firebase provider, or what is it? So, but we're not going to directly go and say, give us a Firebase provider. We're going to say, give us an auth provider. Remember that we had an abstract class called auth provider here, which pretty much defines the logic, or defines the interface for every auth provider, whether it's a Firebase auth provider, Gmail auth provider, Facebook, whatever. That's how the interface should look like. Okay, so what we need to do is to create a constructor, and in here what we're going to say is to give us an auth provider. So we expect an auth provider auto import. Okay, so if you're getting errors here, it's because you haven't imported auth provider the way Visual Studio Code just imported it for me right now. And let's say that we get that we call it provider in our constructor. And if you remember correctly from the previous chapter, we need to also make sure that auth block always has an initial state. So that's what the block as a superclass requires. So let's see, you see, that's the constructor of the block library's block class that says it should have an initial state. So our initial state is going to be in the state of loading. So let's say auth state loading, like that, and we create a constant out of it. Okay, so, and I can see right now that I'm not using strcpy so much, so I'm just going to minimize, or yeah, I'm just moving it to another screen so we don't get bothered by it, and that enables me then to increase the size of Visual Studio Code in width, so it's a little bit easier to read. So I'm going to go create a constant here, and then we're going to create our curly brackets in order to go to the actual initializer, or the constructor of this auth block. Okay. All right, now your job in here inside the auth block is to actually handle various events, and then based on those events, produce a state. What is the first event? Remember this event? Initialize. So if the user tells us to initialize our auth block, what should we do? Well, we should go to that provider and actually tell it to initialize. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to say on auth event initialize. And remember, every on function, you see, it takes the event. Let's see, actually, yeah, it's the event and then an emitter. It's not so clear from this. I mean, from looking at this, it's quite generic. I would say it's too generic, but that's the way it is. So we take the event that came in. So in case you need to extract some data from your initialize, in this case, initialize is an empty class, so it has no data. But when we actually start loading, for instance, and we start handling the login event, we do need the events to actually come in so that we can extract this email and password, okay? But in the case of event initialize, the event is pretty much useless. So we could literally ignore it by just doing something like this, okay? But we're gonna take it in anyways. So now that we have that event, the second parameter in here is called emit. And emit then allows you to actually emit and send states from your auth block out to whoever is watching the state changes in your auth block, which is going to be our UI. Okay, so emit is your way out, is your communication channel to the outside world. So let's make this function asynchronous, because we are actually going to call our provider and call some asynchronous functionality on it. So let's go ahead and see if we can do that. So the first thing that we need to do in here is to call our provider and say initialize, okay? And initialize, you can see, it returns a future of void. So I'm just going to await on it. All right. So then what we're going to do is to say, okay, after doing that, we're going to say final user is provider current user. And that is an optional auth user, if you remember from its function signature or from its getter signature, you see. Now, if the auth user is null after doing an initialize, then we know that the state should be logged out. It means we initialize the provider, but there is no user. You are logged out. Okay, so let's just say if user is null, then we're going to emit a new state, and we're going to say auth state logged out like this as a constant. Okay. However, if there is a user, so so now we have a user, we're sure that we're not coming into this block here that says auth user is null. If there is a user, but that user is not email verified, then we're going to produce another state. So let's say if, else if user is email verified not, so it's not email verified, then we're going to emit a const auth state needs verification. Okay, so that makes sense as well. Otherwise, we're going to say where our state is auth state logged in. And remember, the logged in state actually needs your user. Okay, so that is actually working quite well right now. And now it says user. That shouldn't really happen because the user actually isn't null. So we have already checked the user. So we could put, let's see, what is it actually complaining about? User, the value of type null can't be assigned to a parameter of auth user in a const constructor. Try using a subtype or removing the keyword const. And I mean, I understand this part, to be honest with you, and that's correct. That's a mistake that I've made in here, and that's because I said a constant constructor is being called with a user, which is a variable. So you should also know that we can't do that, all right? Because user in itself is not const, hence we can't call a const constructor on a state that uses a variable user, okay? Great. Now we've handled the initialize event, all right? What we need to do is to handle the login event. So let's go ahead. After this, I'm just going to put a comment in here and just say initialize, just to make things a little bit separate from each other, and then log in. So I'm going to bring the code up so you see it. Sorry about that. It was a little bit hidden when I wrote this comment. So now you can see how it looks like. Then we're going to handle login events. So remember, again, an event is something that the UI is going to send us. And that event, if you remember, it has a username, sorry, an email and a password. Then we're going to unpack that email and password, give it to our provider, provide it to our provider, give it to the provider, and then react to the various results that come back from the provider. Okay. So we're going to say then on auth event login, login. Then we're going to say event and then emit. And we're going to say this is an async function and it goes in here. All right. So, okay. Now, this is the beauty of a block. Using emit, you can let your consumers know what you're up to. let's say someone says log in. What is the first thing that we're up to? Yeah, we are loading. We are in the state of loading because we're going to start loading and make API calls. And that's exactly why we have these auth states in here. Remember, we have the auth state of loading. So let's change our state. As soon as you tell us to log in, we're going to say, oh, now we're loading. Okay. Because we don't have a state that says logging in, but we have a general state that says loading. If you want to, you could remove this loading state and just say, I have a class, for instance, auth state logging in. That's also acceptable, but then you have to have a something in state for everything. Like even if you're logging out, you should say auth state logging out. So then you have to have a loading state for pretty much all the states that do something asynchronous. And that's why we haven't done that. We have a generic or a general loading state that indicates to the outside world that, hey, we are doing something, okay? Don't worry about all these saved operations that I did in this auth state file. I pretty much, I mean, I didn't change anything in this file, okay? So it is how we left it when we finished auth state implementation. All right, so let's in here then emit an auth state loading, just like that. And upon logging in, what we need to do is just to grab the email. So we're just going to say email is equal to the event email, and password is equal to the event password, okay? And then we're going to do a try and catch like this, and then tell our provider. So we're going to say await provider. I believe we let's see what the problem in here. Avoid empty. Okay, that's fine. So let's then create a user. So let's say final user is equal to provider dot. We have a login function on our provider. Excuse me. And here we're literally passing email and password to that function, okay? And remember, login function at the provider level, it could throw an exception, but that's fine because we have a catch in here. So if you go to the login function in our auth provider, let's see if we can find Firebase auth provider. Inside login function, let's see if we can find that here. We have various exceptions that are going to be thrown. User not found, wrong password, generic auth exception. So if any of those exceptions happen, we're going to come into this catch block, all right? So now that we have a user, if nothing happens, if no exceptions happen, then we're going to emit, and we're going to say const, or actually we can't do a const because the user is a variable. So we're going to say auth state logged in, and it's just going to say give us a user, and that's the user. Should any exception happen, we're going to emit a login failure, and we're going to say emit auth state log was it failure? Login failure, I can see. Yeah. And in here, we literally pass the exception there. Can't be assigned. And then, so we probably just have to say, I mean, I understand this exception as well. It's because exceptions in Dart, maybe this is a little bit of a side talk, but exceptions in Dart can be anything. I mean, I posted something on LinkedIn and Twitter a while ago saying that, well, you can even throw an enum value as an exception. And that's why in Dart, exceptions are of type object. And in this case, I believe they're even optional object. No, it's actually an object. So here, the error is that you're saying that auth state login failure, that needs an exception, but you're passing it an object. So let's say on exception. So if an exception happens, then catch that. And that's because we know that our login function is not actually, let's have a look at the login function and see if it can throw anything other than an exception. And we see now that it has a general catch block, which throws a generic auth exception, which in turn is an exception. So in our application right now, as it is, we're not throwing anything that is not an exception. So every exception is coming from the exception class. All right, fantastic. Now we have our login event in place, and we're emitting the correct states, logged in or login failure. Now we have to handle logout. So let me bring the code up, and we're going to say logout. And this is very similar to login, a little bit less code. So let's just say on. again, we're going to handle inputs. Okay, so auth event log out. So if someone tells us to log out like this, then we're going to say, okay, we take the state. Oh, so much documentation everywhere. Um, sorry, the event, and then the emit, and then we make this function asynchronous like that. And the first thing that we have to do, again, since in logout, we're going to call the logout on our provider, which is an asynchronous function, we need to tell the UI about that. We need to tell the UI that upon you requesting log out from the auth block, we have to do some loading. What better way of indicating that to the output, to the outside world, by actually changing our state using emit? So we're going to say auth state loading. Okay, so that's us indicating to the outside world that we're doing something. All right, so let's then do a try and catch in here. Cat on exception, catch E, like this. If an exception occurs, then we're going to say emit auth state failure. We had a logout failure, and that expected an exception. So I'm just going to put the E in there. We could also put this emit in try. It doesn't matter because this doesn't really throw an exception. It can never throw an exception, but we're going to put it in try catch because I believe just it's a little bit cleaner. It's like a transaction. So what we're going to do is to say await our provider and log out in here. All right. And should the logout actually go through, then we're going to go to the next line, which is line 40 for me, maybe another line number for you. And then in this case, we're just going to emit a const of auth state logged out. Fantastic. All right. So that was it, really. I mean, there was just a lot of talk, a lot of creation of like classes, but we've now gotten there. So now we have an auth block, and then we have our auth event and auth state. So now that we have those, I'm going to close those tabs after you've saved them. So make sure that those files are also saved. Then what we're going to do is just to get rid of that ugly counter block that we created in the previous chapter, which kind of is like dirtying down our main user interface. So let's go to main Dart, and let's grab this home page the way we have here. Let's see. So let's go in this new homepage that we created for our counter block and just completely remove that, everything that is related to that counter block, okay? And then let's go ahead and bring back our normal homepage like that. All right, fantastic. We have Flutter block and block in there, and that is causing a little bit of a problem, but that's okay too. So what we need to do now is to actually go and let me bring up the next caption in here. As you can see, now we need to use block provider and block builder, and we're going to do that in our main Dart file. So I hope you haven't jumped over the previous chapter, because I talked a lot about in the previous chapter about block providers, block builders, block listeners, block consumers, and what they are, how they're different from each other. And there's a lot of information and material available online that you can read also about all these things online. But if you've skimmed over that chapter and didn't understand really how things worked, what we need in here, just think of it, that our main application needs the auth block. The auth block is responsible now from this point on to handle everything related to authentication. It is not the UI part. Remember, the UI part is completely separate. That's the goal of block in its core, to separate business logic from presentation logic. So your presentation logic, everything related to the UI, for instance, displaying dialogues, displaying exceptions, handling etc., etc. That's all in the UI, has nothing to do with the auth block. But the auth block is going to be responsible for actually initializing the authentication process, and also with Firebase, and also allowing us to log in and log out, etc. We need the auth block. So how do we get auth block in our main application? Since the entire application is dependent on the auth block, even when you're in the main UI of the application, you should still be able to, for instance, log out. Then we could literally say that, oh, everything inside our application in the main function is going to be dependent on that auth block. So what we're going to do is in our home page, let's see in here. Here, we're right now saying we have a home const home page, you see? Actually, let me Command S this and bring strcpy back here. So now we see our notes back. So homepage is fixed now. So what we are going to do in here, we're going to, instead of a const homepage, we're going to replace this with an auth provider. Okay. Now we could do this. As you can see, we have, with a block provider. I have the block extension in Visual Studio Code, which then gives me the ability to wrap things with various block components and Flutter block components. And you can go to extensions and install the block libraries extension for Visual Studio Code. If you're using another development environment, if you're, for instance, using Sublime, you may not have that ability. So what you'll need to do is to write this by hand. So I'm going to take advantage of wrapping this homepage with a block provider, meaning that my homepage now, let's see here, let's say this is a const as well, is a homepage before its creation is dependent on the creation of a block. Okay. So let's go in here and say the block provider is also using our auth block, which I believe now Visual Studio Code is going to auto import. You may need to import that by hand if you are not using Visual Studio Code or a text editor or an IDE that has this feature. Now, in the create parameter of our block provider, we actually have to create the block that we promised we're going to create. And you can see that being created here. So, and I can now see directly in here, it's creating a const provider, but we can't have that simply because our auth block, if you go back to our auth block in here, I believe that our constructor is not constant. So if you put const in there, you can see that it's not allowing us to do that simply because block itself as a library, as a class here, it has no constant constructor. So we can't have a constant provider. So let's remove that const from there, okay? Now in here, we have to say it should create auth block. And if you remember, auth block requires an auth provider. So let's go in here and say Firebase auth provider, and that's going to be auto imported as well. Perfect. Now we have our block provider. That's fantastic. So now what we need to do is to have a look in here and see what else we have to change in our main functionality. Well, what we have at the moment, I mean, we have, of course, we have this functionality here to create the auth block for us in the main function, but we're not actually really using that inside here. We're using Future Builder, okay? So what we need to do instead of using Future Builder, let's use our, what we're going to do is you're going to use Block Provider. Block Builder. And Block Builder is kind of like Future Builder, but it's going to use our block, which is defined here. Now, this may seem all very complicated to begin with, and what you need to understand is that there's a lot of magic happening behind the scenes in Block, in that when you create a block provider in here, and then it gets a context, and then it goes here to create the block, what's happening internally in Block is that that context itself is going to get injected with your auth block. So when you create the auth block in here, this context from this point on inside the entire application is going to be populated with an auth block that you can read from. Okay, and I'll show you now how. So in the build function of your homepage, what you need to do in here, we're going to say, let's see, we have this future, we have this switch of the snapshot, and that's all fine. So let's just then go ahead. Actually, what we need to do, to be honest with you, is to, we're not going to use so much of this code. So it's perhaps makes more sense just to shift it down a little bit to make room for our block provider. Okay. So a block builder. So our block builder has a builder function, but we also are going to get hold of our actual block in here in the block builder, as you'll soon see. When you come to your homepage, what the first thing that we need to do is to tell our auth block to initialize itself. Do you remember our auth block has this event handling for initialize? So somehow in this build function, we need to tell our auth block, hey, initialize yourself. So how do we get hold of that? I talked about this. How do we get hold of the auth block in here, since we don't have access to it here? But I just mentioned that when you create an auth provider, a block provider, that block provider is going to inject your auth block into the context. So the auth block is hidden somewhere in this context, and the way to read that is you just say context dot read, and then there's a function in here, and if you go into this read function, you see it actually comes from provider here. So Flutter provider dart. Okay, so in context read, let's just say that we're looking for auth block, and what we're going to tell it to is to tell it to initialize. But if you put dot in here, you see there is no function called initialize or anything. And that's because the way you communicate with an auth block, as we saw in, or the way that you communicate with a block generally is that you send it messages using its add function. So add is your way of communicating with your block or your blocks about various events that you're sending. Okay, so in here, we're going to say add, and then we're going to say auth event initialize. Okay, if you're getting an error about this auth event initialize not being in context, it's probably because you don't have an auto import for this file in here, which I had. So great, we are sending initialize events to our auth block. Now that that is done, we need to do our block builder. So in this builder function, let me go here and get help from Visual Studio Code to complete that. And you can see now I get a context and a state. So let's go ahead and handle various states that could happen during this period, during the initialization period. Okay, so let's say if the state is auth state logged in. So if we are actually logged in, then we're going to return const notes view like that. So that is this view. All right. Else if state is auth state needs verification, then let's see what we were doing. We were returning this verify email view. So let's go ahead and do that here as well. Now, if, excuse me, if the state is logged out, excuse me again, is auth state logged out, then let's see how we were handling that before. If we were logged out, we were going to the login view, like here. So if we were logged out, then we should send the user to the login view. Otherwise, if it's not those states, so what can we do? Let's say that in the future, you're going to add some more states that this block builder right now is not able to handle. So what you want is still an application that is in working condition. You shouldn't crash or anything. So let's just, in this case, return a scaffold and make it constant. And let's, in the body of our scaffold, create a circular progress indicator, just like that. All right. So it looks like that. And also, you could mark your block builder as well to say that it has the auth block, and also it has auth states. You remember block builder has these parameters in, you see, the builder, the block itself and the state. That's why I've marked them like this. Okay, and now as you can see, state is not it's not just a normal object anymore. It's an auth state. Before writing that, state was just an object, but now I've marked it as auth state, and you can see it's become an auth state here as well. Great stuff. Now let's get rid of the future builder that we had from before. So I'm going to remove all that code. Excuse me. And now you can see we have our our block builder here and a block provider up there. So that's all we have to do. Now it's great. Actually, we're getting this issue, and you can see I love these errors. I mean, a lot of developers are scared of stuff like this, but it's so important to actually read what's inside this. What is telling us is this happens because you use the build context that does not include the provider of your choice, and that's because of this. You see, is this thing context read auth block. So so what Flutter is saying that, hey, you're expecting me to extract an auth block from the context, but it's not there. Okay, why is it not there? It's simply because the main function, I've mentioned this quite a few times in the course, but I believe it's so important that I want to mention it again. The main function does not get called during hot reloads. And I just did a hot reload by doing Command S. So there is no block inside the context because the block is actually created by the block provider, which is inside the main function. So if I want this auth block to be injected in the build context, then I have to do a hot restart. So now the application is working as it should. All right. Excuse me. So we've now taken care of our main Dart file, removed the stuff that we had for the counter application, which we created with auth, which we created with block. And now we've moved to using our first two components from block, which is block provider and also block builder. We have a few unused imports, so let's just remove those. Okay, just to make sure that this file is quite clean. That part is done. Now, what we need to do is to use, as you can see in the caption, we need to use our auth block in the login view. And the only thing we really need to do is upon pressing the login button, we need to send the auth event login to our auth block. That's very, very simple. So let's go ahead and take care of that. This is just easy from this point on. Go to login view as the caption indicates, and where we're calling this login functionality here. As you can see, we're saying we're taking the email and password and we're just calling a login. So let's see, we also have is email verified, so we're not gonna take care of that at this point. So we're not gonna really take care of email verified. So in this try statement here, verify email route, we will fix that soon. So let's just remove this, try everything in the try block. And what we need to do in here, we need to read our block, our auth block, and then convey an event to it. Okay, how do we read the block? And that is using context dot read, or what was it called? Read, I believe, actually, yeah. But remember, auth block, and its read function is not available until you import your provider. And I can see in here it says package provider src, but in our main file we didn't actually import provider, so we've imported our Flutter block. So let's go ahead and do that as well in here. So inside login view Dart, please import your Flutter block. So now all of a sudden we're going to have access to the read function. Okay. So in there, what we're going to do is just to add an event to our, let's see if we can get access. Oh, for that, we need probably to import block as well. So package, excuse me, block, and then block part. Okay. Let's see if then all of a sudden we're going to get the add functionality in here. Context read. Oh, sorry about that. It's because this is a function. I need to call the function. So add. And I may then get away by removing block from here. I apologize for that. We didn't really need to import block library as such. Okay, I understand this is a little bit jumpy. That's okay though. So all we're doing is that we removed everything in the try block, and we're replacing that using context read. We're reading our auth block from the build context, and now we want to tell it to log in. So do you remember we had a auth event login? So let's go ahead and do that. And as you can see, it's going to auto import it for us. So in here we have the email and password. Fantastic. So that's that. All right, so that's gonna send that event, and then we have the rest of the exceptions. Now, remember, I understand you may think, oh, exceptions though, how are we handling them? Well, we are not. at the moment, our exception handling is completely broken. By going towards using Auth Bloc, everything is broken as far as exceptions go. Because you can see the way our Auth Bloc actually throws exceptions is by emitting them inside states. So you see it says a state login failure, and then there's an exception in it. So we're not handling those at the moment. So you're right, exceptions are completely broken for the entirety of this chapter. And that's okay, because we're going to fix them exactly right after this chapter. So now you know what's coming in the next chapter as well. All right, that's for our login. So I don't think we need to do more, to be honest, inside our login. So let's go into our imports and just clean up the imports as well. Great stuff. So that's for login. What we also have to do now, as the caption indicates, we have to go to our notes view and make sure that we can log out using our auth block as well. So let's go to a notes view here. And right now, what we're doing is saying we're awaiting on the auth service Firebase logout. So we're not going to do that anymore. So we're just going to use our auth block in order to log out. So in here, let's remove that and just say that we're saying we want to grab the auth block first. Okay, so let's say context, and then we're going to read our auth block like this. And if we ask Visual Studio Code, it wants to import it wants to import auth block. So let's grab auth block to bring it in. It also doesn't know where read comes from. So what we need to do now is to import the block library in here. So I'm just gonna copy that code from my notes. So importing Flutter block and then Flutter block Dart. And here I'm actually drilling down inside Flutter block and just saying that I'm interested in read context. Okay, and read context is, as you can see in the code, is the function read in here. Oh my God, there's so much documentation here. You see. All right, so that gives us the read functionality that we can use in here. So that's the function. All right, after grabbing our auth block, now we have to convey the message of logging out in here. So we're going to add an event to it, and then we're going to say we add the event of auth event log out, just like that. And this is a constant constructor as well. So let's just send it through. And after doing that, we don't really have to do so much more. So and we're also not, in this case, we're not actually gonna go to the login view. So what is gonna happen in here, I'm actually gonna remove that, and we're gonna start testing a little bit so you'll see how things work, okay? So I'm gonna do a hot restart in here and see if everything's working as it should. So yeah, what I'm gonna do then, let's test log out, okay? So in here, I'm just gonna say this log out, and it says log out or cancel. I'll say cancel. So that's working as it should. And I say log out and then log out. And all of a sudden we came to the login view, but hey, wait a minute, what happened? We removed this code that was here. Why are we going to the login view without that code? So this may look magical, but what is happening is that since the entire application is now using our auth block, and auth block, upon it receiving the logout event, let's go to the auth block. So you get reminded of the logout event. But what it is saying is that it first goes to the loading state, and then if it could log the user out, then it actually says that I'm logged out. Now remember, in the main function here, we are actually listening to various events that come from our auth block. And when the event that comes in is logged out, we are showing the login view. So it is the main, it's the homepage that is doing this work. So it's, to me, it is absolutely beautiful, because we are like removing logic from our code one step at a time. So inside our login as well, so when we need to, let's go to the login view here. Let's have a look in here at login. You see, after login, we're not telling the application that you have to go to a screen X or screen Y. So we can actually test this. So I'm going to say my email address here, and foobar baz, and then login. You see, it comes to the main screen. How did that do that? And that's again because of the main Dart. You see, it first said if it's in the state of loading. Let's see, are we handling loading somewhere? No, we're not using that. But if it actually becomes logged in, then it says display the notes view. So that's how these screens are now being shuffled and displayed to the user without us having to do push routes or push name routes. So fantastic, very well done. We've taken care of everything that we said we were going to take care of in this chapter. So what we usually do at the end of every chapter is, now that you're familiar with everything, you've come so far, almost 40 chapters in this course, so you should know that we need to tag our work so that we don't lose them. So let's go ahead and have a look at, if I can bring terminal up in here, and we see git log. You can see the last commit was step 22. So let's say git commit, git status first, actually. A whole new folder was added. So we're going to say git add all. And let me increase the size of the screen as well. So we're going to say git commit and step 23. Okay. And push these changes. And we have a look at our logs, get step 22 and step 23, and there is nothing to commit at this point. So let's also tag our work, and we say step 23 and git push tags. Okay, fantastic. So if you look at our tags now, we have 20, 21, 22, 23. Okay. Fantastic. As is tradition, at the end of every chapter, we talk about what we're going to discuss in the chapter that is coming. And as I mentioned just briefly, as a little note while I was talking about exception handling, we've now broken our exception handling in that, you see, when we send an add signal to our block, our auth block, that in itself is not going to produce an exception. But right now we're treating that add function and we're putting it inside a try block, and then there's on exception blah blah after that. So none of those exception handling catches are going to be caught. So we're going to handle that and fix that in the next chapter. So grab some refreshments and I'll see you there.